A researcher named Laura Carstensen at Stanford spent decades tracking how people's social preferences change across the lifespan, and one of her most consistent findings directly contradicts what most people assume about older men who seem less interested in dating and relationships. It is not bitterness. It is not heartbreak. It is not giving up. Her research on what she calls socio-emotional selectivity theory found that as people age, they do not lose interest in connection. They become dramatically more selective about it. And for men specifically, that shift gets misread constantly. My name is Frank, and if you are a Gen X man who has felt this shift happening in yourself, or if you are someone trying to understand a man in your life who suddenly seems less interested in the chase, this video is going to walk you through what the psychology actually says is happening. Let us start with the assumption that gets made about this shift, because the assumption is almost always wrong. People assume a man who steps back from dating or emotional intensity is protecting himself from getting hurt again. Guarded, closed off, damaged goods in the cruelest version of the narrative. But researchers studying solitude preference across the adult lifespan found something very different happening under the surface. A study published examining solitude-seeking in midlife and older adulthood found that when older adults chose to be alone, it did not produce a dip in their mood the way it consistently did for middle-aged adults. Solitude stopped being something to escape from and became something actively chosen for its own value. The researchers were careful to note this was not withdrawal, it was preference. Here's the piece that connects directly to the Gen X experience specifically. If you grew up in a house where you managed your own afternoons alone, where nobody was reliably present to co-regulate your emotional world, you built an early and unusually functional relationship with solitude. That relationship does not disappear as you age. It matures. And there's research showing exactly what that maturity looks like physiologically. Researchers at the University of Southern California found that older adults show greater prefrontal cortex activity than younger adults when processing emotional information, meaning the age and brain does not become less capable of connection. It becomes more considered, more selective about where it invests. This is the part that gets consistently misunderstood by the people around an older man who has quietly become more selective. It looks like disinterest. It is often the opposite. Susan Charles, whose research on emotional regulation across adulthood has been widely cited, describes what she calls practiced selectivity. Older adults default toward the positive without consciously deciding to. They let smaller conflicts pass. They choose their battles with more precision than they did at 30. This is not a man who has stopped caring about relationships. This is a man whose nervous system has gotten remarkably good at identifying which relationships are actually worth the emotional cost and declining the ones that are not. For a Gen X man specifically, that calculation carries extra weight. You spent your adolescence managing your own emotional regulation because nobody was reliably doing it for you. You built the skill early, and by the time you reach your 50s, that skill has had 4 decades to sharpen. What looks like a man being unusually picky is often a man who has simply gotten very good at a form of emotional accounting most people never develop until much later, if at all. There's a specific finding from Carstensen's research that deserves direct attention because it explains something that surprises a lot of people. Older men who have never married report lower loneliness than older men who were married and then separated but are not currently living with a partner. That's a counterintuitive result. It suggests that the absence of a relationship is not automatically the problem. The specific quality of the relationships a person has and whether those relationships match what they actually need at that stage of life matters enormously more than whether a relationship exists at all. This connects to something researchers describe as socio-emotional selectivity in its purest form. As people perceive their remaining time as more limited, whether that's due to age or life circumstance, they naturally shift their social goals from breadth to depth. In their 20s and 30s, most people are optimizing for information, options, and the widest possible social network. Later in life, the goal shifts to emotional meaning, fewer people, more depth. And the men who understand this shift and lean into it deliberately are not withdrawing from life. They are allocating a finite emotional resource according to a much more sophisticated internal calculus than they had access to at 25. Here's where this becomes specific to what a lot of Gen X men describe when they talk about modern dating and relationships in midlife. It's not that connection has stopped mattering, it's that the cost-benefit calculation has changed dramatically. At 25, chaos and drama in a relationship could feel like passion because the nervous system had not yet learned to distinguish between intensity and value. By 50, a man who has spent decades learning to regulate his own emotional state has also learned, often the hard way, what unregulated chaos in another person actually costs him. Peace is not the absence of passion, it's the presence of a nervous system that finally knows the difference between stimulation and stability. There's also a piece of this that has nothing to do with women and everything to do with self-respect, and it deserves to be named directly. Men who spent their adolescence managing their own emotional world without anyone reliably validating their effort learned early that validation from outside sources is unreliable. It comes and it goes according to other people's moods, not according to your actual worth. That's a hard lesson to learn at 10 years old, but it produces something valuable by 50. A man who is not chasing validation from a partner because he stopped needing an external source to tell him what he already worked out for himself decades ago. The research on aging and emotional regulation consistently uses a specific phrase that applies here: emotional wisdom, not emotional coldness, not emotional exhaustion. Wisdom, the capacity to look at a potential relationship and assess with real clarity built from decades of data whether it will add to a life that is already stable or whether it will introduce chaos into a piece that took 40 years to build. That's not bitterness. That's the single most sophisticated relationship skill a human being can develop, and it only becomes available after enough time and enough lived experience to actually calibrate it. Here is the honest summary of what the psychology actually shows. Older men who seem less interested in dating and relationship drama have not given up on connection. They have refined their definition of what connection is actually worth to them. Solitude stopped being a fallback position and became an active preference with real measurable psychological benefits. Selectivity is not pickiness for its own sake. It's the direct result of a lifetime spent learning to distinguish between what feels intense and what is actually good for you. And self-respect, built slowly and sometimes painfully across decades, has finally become non-negotiable rather than something available to trade away for company. This is not the story of men giving up on women. This is the story of men who finally learned, after enough decades of data, what actually deserves a place inside the piece they spent a lifetime building. Leave a comment and tell me if this describes a shift you have felt in yourself or in a man you know. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want more videos like this. I'll see you next time.